Mr. President, I come today to talk about spending and its impact on economic growth. I think it's important that Washington closely consider the true impact that federal spending and our soaring national debt is having on economic growth. Over the past few weeks, the White House and the President have been out campaigning across the country and making statements aimed at causing fear and anxiety about the sequester. The White House has painted the sequester, which, keep in mind, Mr. President, amounts to just 2.4% of all federal spending, as something that would lead to an economic disaster in this country. But the White House's attempts to cause fear and anxiety have fallen flat. And what's more, many of the claims that were made were just simply false. In fact, the critics agree. Bill Keller wrote in the New York Times, and I quote, that the White House spent last week in full campaign hysteria, end quote. The Washington Post issued 4 Pinocchios with regard to false claims made by Education Secretary Arne Duncan about the sequester's impact on teachers' jobs. The National Journal said, and I quote, the White House's strategy to exaggerate the immediate impact of the cuts has backfired, end quote. And in Politico, and I quote again, for all the hype, spin, and blame exchanged over the across-the-board cuts, the reality is they don't mean the sudden economic collapse of America, end quote. Well, Mr. President, it's important to see the sequester in its overall context. And all the hype associated with this could be analogous, I suppose, to all the hype we had yesterday about the weather. Everybody expected we were going to have the big blizzard, the blizzard of 2013, and it never materialized. Well, all the predictions of doom and gloom with regard to sequester have also not amounted to very much. And I think the American people have picked up on that, Mr. President. I think most of them agree, if you look at public opinion polls, that Washington does need to tighten its belt. Washington does need to reduce its spending. Washington needs to lessen the appetite that it has to take more of the American taxpayers' money and spend it on things that I think most taxpayers view to be not really necessary. And so when you talk about a 2.4% reduction in overall federal spending, most Americans, when they evaluate their own financial situations, come to the conclusion, I think, that most of them probably could absorb, if they had to, that 2.4% reduction in their own spending. They would look at their budgets in very realistic ways. They would scrutinize and examine where they could find spending that's low priority, things that they could live without. What we've seen here in Washington from the administration is various heads of agencies and departments going out and trying to identify the biggest, most high-profile thing for dramatic effect to try and scare and frighten the American people. But I think the American people recognize, Mr. President, and hopefully the administration has come to the conclusion as well, that a 2.4% reduction in overall federal spending is something that we need to absorb here in Washington, D.C., and demonstrate to the American people that we're serious about getting Washington's fiscal house in order. I've maintained that the sequester is not the best way to rein in federal spending. There is a better way to do it. The reductions that are called for in the sequester disproportionately impact certain areas of the budget. We all know about the impact on the national security budget, which represents only 20% of federal spending, but gets 50% of the cuts in the sequester. I would have preferred a different approach. But given the refusal of President Obama and Senate Democrats to come to the table and to find alternative savings, the sequester has gone into effect. What the President and most Senate Democrats wanted to see happen, Mr. President, was an increase in taxes, something that many of us believe would be very harmful to the economy. And if you look at what the President has already gotten in terms of tax increases, since he's been in office, it amounts to about $1.7 trillion. So if you look at just the last 4 years and all the promises that were made about additional spending, stimulus spending, $1 trillion in additional stimulus spending back when the President first took office, how that would impact the economy. We were told that that would take unemployment down below 6%. Well, of course, we all know today what's happened. We continue to experience sluggish, slow, anemic growth, chronic high unemployment, and we continue to pile massive amounts of debt on the backs of our children and grandchildren. And so while the President's been seeking to cause alarm and cast blame with regard to the sequester, one really has to question the economic arguments that he's making. The President and his allies in Congress claim that he inherited a bad economy and that increased spending is necessary to stimulate economic growth. So President Obama's agenda since he's been in office has been to spend more, tax more, and regulate more. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, over $1.7 trillion in new taxes have been imposed. He signed into law since he took office. The most recent of that, the fiscal cliff, $620 billion on January the 1st. But if you add up the tax increases in Obamacare, another $1 trillion, over $1 trillion there. And then if you look at the $518 billion in new regulations that have been approved since the President took office, you can see that we have put an enormous amount of cost and burden and new requirements and mandates and harm to the economy and to the small businesses that create jobs. $1.7 trillion in new taxes, $518 billion in new regulations. What has been the impact of those policies? Well, it's pretty clear. Average economic growth under this President has averaged just 0.8%. 0.8% of the overall share of the economy, GDP. And so less than 1% economic growth on average in the 4 years that this President has been in office. Now, to put it in perspective, the President, if you look at past presidents and we've had economic downturns and recessions, President Reagan inherited a bad economy too. When he came to office, we were faced with a series of really difficult economic circumstances, high inflation, high interest rates, weak growth. Well, President Reagan put in place policies that were pro-growth. He enacted pro-growth tax reform, fewer regulations, and the economy grew nearly 3 times as fast as it has under President Obama's watch. The point, very simply, Mr. President, is that if you put the right policies in place, if you make it less difficult and less expensive for small businesses in our economy, for our job creators to create jobs, you get more jobs. You get economic growth. If you make it more difficult and more expensive and harder for our small businesses and our job creators to create jobs, you get fewer jobs and less economic growth and lower take-home pay for American families and workers. If the Obama recovery was as strong as Reagan's, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger today, meaning more jobs and more opportunity for Americans. And that's assuming if you were just getting a comparable level of growth in the economy. The fact is, President Obama's spending, tax, and regulatory policies are hamstringing economic recovery, jobs, and opportunity. In fact, just yesterday, the Federal Reserve released the latest edition of its so-called Beige Book, more formally known as the Summary of Commentary on Current Economic Conditions. The Beige Book stated that the 2010 health care law is being cited as a reason for layoffs and a slowdown in hiring. This report, which examines economic conditions across various Federal Reserve districts throughout the country, stated, and I quote, "Employers in several districts cited the unknown effects of the Affordable Care Act as reasons for planned layoffs and reluctance to hire more staff," end quote. Mr. President, it's clear that President Obama's policies are the real threat to our economy, not the sequester. 2.4% reduction, across-the-board reduction in federal spending here in Washington, D.C. is something that clearly, if you look at the rate of growth that we've seen in spending since the President took office, over 20% since 2009, 2.9% in the overall scheme of things is something that seems very reasonable, and I think the American people see it as very reasonable. But on the contrary, if you look at the policies the President's put in place, whether that's more stimulus spending, growing government, higher taxes, more regulations, we're getting a very, very different picture of what those policies look like in terms of the impact on our economy. We've seen negative impacts, high levels of spending, high annual deficits during the President's first term, and as a consequence of that, slower economic growth. Mr. President, I want to submit, if I might, for the record, an opinion piece by Michael Boskin. He wrote it for the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, and in that piece, Mr. Boskin makes the case that spending cuts will actually help the economy. Mr. Boskin wrote that standard Keynesian economic models that claim a quick economic boost from higher government spending actually show that the effect turns quickly negative. In other words, spending needs to be repeated over and over like a drug to keep the hypothetical positive effect going. Mr. Boskin points to an academic study that found that returning spending to the pre-crisis, pre-Obama levels, which would be about 3% reduction in spending as a percentage of our entire GDP, would increase short-term economic growth because expectations of lower future taxes and debt lead to higher incomes and more private spending and investment. So again, Mr. President, just to sort of wrap things up here and to put it into perspective, federal spending has increased nearly 20% since 2009. Sequestration, the across-the-board spending reductions that will occur under the sequester, amount to a reduction of just 2.4% out of a $3.5 trillion budget. Even with the sequester, the government will spend more this year than it did last year. So I would hope that the President would begin to be honest with the American people about what the impact of his tax hikes, his spending, and new regulations are having on our nation's economic growth and recovery. And more important than coming to the conclusion and being honest with the American people about that, change his policies. Actually come to the conclusion based on economic growth on average for the first 4 years. And as I said before, high unemployment, chronic high unemployment, still around that 8% level, and massive amounts of new debt that we're piling on the backs of future generations. Not only do we need the President, in terms of his rhetoric, to be honest with the American people, we need him to change his policies and take a look at the honest relationship between spending and economic growth, which shows that the sequester will not have long-term negative impacts on the economy. We need to put the federal government on a stable fiscal path in order to create the kind of economic certainty that's needed in this country to grow the economy and create jobs. Mr. President, less spending by Washington, D.C. actually will lead to greater economic growth in our private economy, more jobs for the American people, and higher take-home pay. Mr. President, I yield the floor.